There is a place in the memory of the land that has no name anymore. A place where the soil remembers things that the people who walked upon it have long since forgotten. It sits somewhere between what we might call Ohio and what we might call Pennsylvania, though those words would have meant nothing to the ones who lived there, the ones who built their lives in careful layers like the strata of the earth itself, pressing their existence into the ground so that it might remain long after they had gone. This was before the word America existed, before the concept of a nation had been dreamed by anyone living on this continent, before anything had been mapped or measured or given the kind of authority that comes from being written down. The forests then were something that a modern person would not recognize, not merely in their density or their age, but in their character, in the way they seemed to breathe with a consciousness that had been accumulating since the last great ice had retreated and left the land to figure out what it wanted to become. There was a child. There is always a child in stories like this, because children are the ones who notice, and noticing is the most dangerous thing a person can do. Her name, in the language her people spoke, translated roughly into something like, "the one who asks too many questions," a name given with a mixture of affection and warning, the way you might name a dog that has already learned to open doors. She was perhaps 9 years old, or 10, depending on how you count the years in a world where years are not numbered, but simply felt in the body, in the way winter presses into the bones differently each time. She lived with her mother and her grandmother and 2 brothers in a longhouse at the edge of a village that sat beside a river whose voice changed with the seasons, speaking in whispers during the dry months and shouting something urgent and incomprehensible during the spring floods. The village was prosperous, as prosperity was understood then, which meant that people ate, that the children grew, that the old ones were cared for, that the stories were told properly at the right times of year. And there were rules about stories, precise and serious rules that the grandmother enforced with a gravity that made the children understand they were not merely traditions, but something closer to laws of physics, boundaries that existed not because people had decided they should, but because the world itself had arranged them. You did not tell certain stories in summer. You did not speak the names of certain things after dark. You did not look too long into still water. And you did not, under any circumstance, follow a sound into the forest that you could not identify with absolute certainty. The child had broken this last rule before, more than once, following the call of an unfamiliar bird or the sound of what might have been weeping, only to find nothing, to return home muddy and scratched and chastened, her mother's relief curdling quickly into anger. But this particular evening, the evening where our story settles like sediment to the bottom of a jar of disturbed water, this particular evening was different in a quality that is difficult to describe without resorting to the language of feeling, which is imprecise, but perhaps the only language adequate to what happened. The light had changed. That is the most accurate way to say it. The light that fell across the village in the late afternoon had taken on a quality that the child could not name, something that was not quite golden and not quite gray, something that seemed to exist at a frequency slightly outside the normal range of visible colors, the way a sound can sit just at the edge of hearing and fill you with unease without your being able to point to it and say, "There, that is the thing that frightens me." The shadows fell at the wrong angles. She noticed this first. The shadows of the tall posts at the edge of the village were pointing in a direction that did not correspond to where the sun sat in the sky, and she stood for a long moment looking back and forth between the sun and the shadows, trying to reconcile them, failing. She did not tell anyone. This was her first mistake, and it was the kind of mistake that children make not out of malice or stupidity, but out of a desire to understand a thing completely before submitting it to adult authority, because adults have a way of explaining things that closes them off, that puts them in a box and labels the box, and ends the inquiry. She wanted to understand the shadows first. She was the one who asks too many questions, and asking required that you remain open, that you not yet seek the answer that someone else had already prepared for you. That night, The grandmother told stories. She sat in the center of the longhouse near the fire, and the children arranged themselves around her with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times, who understood that their position in this circle was not arbitrary but carried meaning. The grandmother was old, in a way that was difficult to quantify. She had been old for as long as the child could remember, the kind of old that seems to have always been, that predates your own memory of the world. Her face was a map of something that the child was not yet old enough to read, creased and darkened and expressive in ways that went far beyond the movement of her features. The grandmother began, as she always began, with a story that was essentially a greeting, a kind of verbal handshake with the invisible things that might be listening, a way of establishing that you knew they were there and that you respected the protocols. And then she told a longer story, a familiar one, about a hunter who had gone too far north and encountered a creature that wore the shape of a person the way a person might wear a coat, loosely, with the shape not quite fitting correctly, the arms perhaps slightly too long, the neck at an angle that was subtly wrong, the smile arranged with care but missing whatever it is that makes a smile mean what it is supposed to mean. The children knew this story. They had heard it many times, but the grandmother told it differently that night, and the child noticed. There were pauses in new places. There were emphases shifted so that different words carried the weight of the sentence, changing the meaning in ways that were small but accumulated. The grandmother was telling the same story, but it was like a song played in a different key, recognizable but altered, and the child felt the difference in her chest, a low vibration of wrongness that she associated with the shadows from earlier in the day. She looked at her brothers to see if they had noticed, but they were watching the fire with the dull, comfortable attention of children who are hearing a familiar story before sleep, and they noticed nothing. After the stories, in the dark, in the specific silence that a fire creates when it is burned low and the whole world has contracted to the size of a single room, the child lay awake and listened to the forest. This was not unusual. She often lay awake listening, and the forest was always there to be heard, its nighttime vocabulary of owls and frogs, and the occasional inexplicable crash of something large moving through undergrowth. But tonight, the forest was quiet, in a way that felt deliberate, the way a room goes quiet when someone enters it who changes the atmosphere, the way a conversation stops when the wrong person walks through the door. And then there was a sound. It came from outside the longhouse, from the direction of the river, and it was the sound of her own name being spoken. Not called loudly, not shouted, but spoken at a conversational volume in the voice of her mother, the specific cadence of her mother's voice when she wanted the child to come to her without alerting the others, the private frequency of their relationship, the sound that meant, "I need you, and I need you quietly." The child sat up. She looked toward where her mother lay sleeping and could see the outline of her, the slow rise and fall of breath, unmistakably, undeniably, asleep. She looked toward the entrance of the longhouse, and she looked back at her sleeping mother. She should have woken her grandmother, she knew this. Some part of her that had been listening to the stories all her life, that had absorbed the rules the way roots absorb water, that part of her knew with crystalline clarity exactly what she should do. But the sound came again, her name, her mother's voice, and the specific variety of love that lives in children and that overrides every other instinct rose up in her like water rises in a vessel, filling every available space, and she got up, and she went to the entrance of the longhouse, and she looked out. The village was silver in the moonlight, the familiar shapes of the other longhouses transformed by that cold light into something that looked almost like a painting of the village, a representation rather than the thing itself, everything correct in outline, but lacking the texture of the real. The fire circles were dark. The drying racks stood like small skeletal trees, and at the edge of the village, at the place where the cleared ground ended and the first trees began, stood a figure that was, in the moonlight and at that distance, exactly her mother's height, exactly her mother's shape, standing with its back to the child and looking into the forest. The figure did not move. It stood with a stillness that seemed purposeful rather than natural, the stillness of something that knows it is being observed and has decided how it wishes to be seen. The child stood in the entrance of the longhouse and looked at the figure, and the figure did not turn and did not move. And after what felt like a very long time, the figure spoke her name again, in her mother's voice, and began to walk into the trees. What happens inside a child in this moment is not simple. It is not the simple calculation of danger that an adult mind might attempt, weighing evidence and probabilities and outcomes. It is something more like an argument between two versions of the self, between the part that loves and the part that knows. And love has been winning this argument since the first consciousness awoke in the first creature that was capable of caring about something beyond its own survival. She followed. She walked across the silver village toward the trees where the figure had disappeared, and the night air was cold against her face, and the ground was damp under her feet, and the forest absorbed her. Inside the trees, the moonlight became fractured, broken into pieces by the canopy overhead, falling in irregular patches that made the ground a kind of puzzle of light and dark, and she could see the figure moving ahead of her, always at the same distance, always just at the edge of visibility, leading her deeper along the bank of the river, where the sound of the water grew from a murmur to a conversation to something almost loud. She called out. She used the word for mother, the word that in her language carried within it the entire history of that relationship, every feeding and scolding and comfort and correction. A word that was more than a label and contained its own kind of love. The figure did not respond with words, but seemed to slow slightly, seemed to acknowledge the call by becoming more distinct, more defined, as if it were gathering itself from the moonlight and the shadows into something more solid. She should have noticed the smell. It came to her gradually, the way smells do in cold air, building from nothing to something, to a presence that could not be ignored. It was the smell of deep water and dark earth, and something else beneath those, something she could not name, but that her body named for her by tightening every muscle simultaneously, by raising the hair on her arms and neck and scalp, by flooding her with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the night. It was the smell of a thing that had not bathed in the way living things bathe, had not cleaned itself of the residue of what it had been eating and where it had been living, and what it had been eating and where it had been living were things that did not bear thinking about. She stopped walking. The figure stopped too. It was still facing away from her, and she could see now, in a patch of moonlight that fell more fully than the others, that there was something wrong with the figure's proportions that she had not been able to see from a distance, or perhaps had not been willing to see. Because the willingness to see clearly is not a constant, but a variable, dependent on how much we need the world to be what we hope it is. The shoulders were too wide. The neck was too long. The arms, when the figure raised one slowly to gesture deeper into the forest, ended at a place that was not where arms should end, extending several inches further than any arm should extend. The figure turned its head. Not its body, only its head, rotating slowly on that too long neck, turning to look back at the child over its shoulder. And the face that looked back at her was her mother's face, in the way that a mask is a face, in the way that a drawing of a person is a person, which is to say it was recognizable, but it was not right. It was the right features arranged with a precision that lacked whatever animates a face from the inside, lacked the unconscious muscular life that makes a face belong to a person rather than merely resemble one. The eyes were the worst part of it. They were the right color and the right shape, and they were in the right places in the right face, and they were completely, absolutely empty, in a way that the child had never seen in any living thing. Empty in a way that suggested not the absence of something, but the presence of something different. Something that occupied the space where feeling and intention should have been, with its own agenda that had nothing to do with either. The child ran. She ran in the direction she believed to be back toward the village, and the forest was dark, and the moon was obscured now by cloud, and behind her she could hear nothing, which was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced, because if something is chasing you through a forest, you will hear it. You will hear the footfalls, or the crashing of branches, or the breathing. You will hear it, unless it moves in a way that does not produce sound, and the thought of what kind of thing moves through a forest without producing any sound at all was a thought she had to set aside, because if she allowed it to complete itself, she would stop running, and stopping was not something she could afford to do. She ran until she could see the faint glow of a banked fire through the trees, and she burst out of the forest into the village and did not stop until she was inside the longhouse and standing over her mother, grabbing her mother's shoulder and shaking it with both hands, and her mother woke with the immediate wakefulness of a person who is accustomed to being woken for emergencies, and her first words were, "What is wrong? What is wrong? Speak to me. Tell me." And the child opened her mouth and found that she could not speak, that the words had been replaced by a shaking that started in her hands and moved through her entire body, a seismic thing, a thing that came from somewhere below language. Her grandmother was awake too. Grandmothers always wake when something is wrong. They wake before anyone else because they are closer to the age where the membrane between the living and whatever is not living becomes thin, and they sense disturbances in that membrane the way old joints sense weather. The grandmother looked at the child with eyes that contained no surprise, only a focused attention, and she asked one question. She asked, "Did you follow it?" And the child, still shaking, nodded, and the grandmother closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was something in them that the child recognized later, in her adult life, as grief. The grandmother did not sleep again that night. She sat by the fire, and she added wood to it, and she kept it burning high, which was unusual, which used wood they could not easily afford to burn, and she chanted something under her breath that was not a story and was not a song, but something older than either, something that seemed to exist at the same frequency as the vibration the child had felt in her chest during the altered story earlier that night. The child sat beside her grandmother, and the fire was very bright, and the night was very long. In the morning, the grandmother took the child to see the oldest man in the village, a man who had passed beyond ordinary elderhood into a territory that had no social category, who was kept alive by the collective will of the community because he was understood to contain knowledge that could not be lost, that had nowhere else to reside. He was very small now, folded into himself by age, but his voice was entirely intact, deep and slow and unhurried in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world, which was not true, but which was perhaps a useful fiction. The grandmother explained what had happened with an efficiency that stripped the narrative of everything except the essential facts, and the old man listened without interrupting, his eyes half closed, his breathing visible and slow. When she finished, the old man was quiet for a very long time. Then he began to speak, and what he described was a thing that did not have a name in the child's language, at least not a name that was safe to use, not a name that could be spoken directly without the risk of functioning as an invitation. He described it in terms of what it did rather than what it was, which is perhaps the only honest way to describe certain kinds of things. He said that it was very old, older than the village and older than the people who had lived where the village now stood before her people had come here, older perhaps than the particular human consciousness that would be capable of conceiving of it as something separate from the world, rather than as an element of it. He said that it lived in the places between the village and the forest, between the sleeping and the waking, between the face you know and the thing wearing the face you know. He said that it fed on following, specifically on the act of following, that the following was not incidental to what it did, but was the essential thing, was perhaps the only thing it truly needed, the way other creatures need water or warmth. The love that made you follow was not a vulnerability it exploited, but was the specific thing it consumed, the way a flower feeds on sunlight, not because sunlight happens to be available, but because the flower has built itself around the transformation of that particular energy into its own life. He told the child, looking at her directly now, with eyes that were clouded with age, but focused with something that preceded age by a significant distance. He told her that she had given it something, and that this meant a relationship now existed between her and the thing that would not easily dissolve. Not a permanent relationship, not an inevitable one, but one that required maintenance to undo, the way a stain requires effort to remove and may or may not respond to effort depending on how long it has been allowed to set. He told her what she needed to do, and some of what he told her is not the kind of thing that translates across time or culture, because it required specific materials and specific words and a specific knowledge of the geography of that particular place, the invisible geography that exists alongside the visible one and that does not appear on any map that was ever made. The child did what she was told. She did it with the seriousness that comes from genuine fear, rather than the performed seriousness that children sometimes adopt when adults are watching them. The real thing. The kind of seriousness that changes a person's face. She did not know if it worked. That is important to say. She was not given the comfort of certainty, of a sign or a confirmation, of the narrative satisfaction of knowing that the thing was gone and the danger was past. She was told only that she had done what could be done, and that she should not expect to feel safe in the way she had felt safe before, but that there was a different kind of safety available to her now, the safety that comes from knowledge, from knowing what is out there and how it moves and what it wants and what you must not give it. She grew up. Of course she grew up. Children do, when the story allows them to, when the thing in the forest is not quite quick enough, or quite hungry enough, or has been given just enough of what it needs to be patient, to wait, to watch and wait. She grew up and became a woman who was known for a certain quality of attention, a way of watching the world that was not paranoid, not fearful, but precise. The way a good hunter watches the forest not with fear of what might be there, but with a clean, clear acknowledgement of what is actually there. She told stories. She sat with children around fires, and she told the stories she had been told, and she told one story that was her own. And the children who heard her tell it carried it with them, in the way you carry something that has changed the shape of the container that holds it, that is no longer merely remembered, but has become part of the structure of the mind that holds the memory. The story spread. Stories always spread. They move through communities and down through generations with a persistence that outlasts every other human artifact, outlasting the buildings and the tools and even, sometimes, the languages in which they were originally told, getting translated into new languages and losing some things and gaining others, and becoming, in the process, something slightly different than they were. The way rivers become different rivers as they move from the mountains to the sea, and yet remain recognizably the same water, finding the same low places. The story of the child who followed the thing wearing her mother's face moved through centuries and through hundreds of miles, and through the dissolution of the world in which it had originated, the burning of villages, and the scattering of people, and the erasure of languages that white men on horseback conducted with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that a people without their stories is a people who can be told different stories, who can be given a different past, and therefore a different understanding of what the present means and what the future might hold. But the story survived. Pieces of it survived. The way that certain insects survive extinction events by retreating into forms so simple and so small that the catastrophe passes over them without noticing. Something of the essential knowledge survived. The knowledge that there are things in the world that wear familiar faces, that use your love as the mechanism of your destruction, that are most powerful precisely when you most want them to be what they appear to be. This is not an allegory, though it has the shape of one. It is not a metaphor for the ways in which human beings deceive and destroy each other, though those parallels are available to anyone who wants to draw them. It is, or was, understood by the people who first told it as a literal description of a literal thing, a thing that had been encountered and survived and must be remembered and warned against. Because the world is larger and stranger than our need for it to be comprehensible, and the things that live in the larger, stranger world do not cease to exist simply because we have stopped believing in them, or because the culture that gave us the language to speak about them has been dismantled. There are still places in the land between the Ohio River and the shores of the Great Lakes where something happens to the light in the late afternoon, where the shadows fall at angles that do not correspond to the position of the sun, where a careful observer, if such an observer happens to be present, might notice that something is slightly wrong with the geometry of the visible world, might feel in their chest that low vibration of wrongness that the child felt on the evening before everything changed for her. Most people, when they feel this, do what people do with feelings that have no obvious cause and no comfortable explanation, which is to dismiss them, to chalk them up to tiredness or low blood sugar or the ambient anxiety of modern life, which provides more than enough material to explain any number of inexplicable feelings without requiring anything as inconvenient as the possibility that the feeling is accurate, that it is a correct perception of an actual condition of the world. And sometimes, in those places, at that hour, if you listen very carefully, you might hear something. It might be a voice you recognize. It might be speaking your name at a conversational volume in the cadence that belongs to someone you love, in the frequency that is the private frequency of your relationship with them, the sound that means, I need you, and I need you quietly. And if you are very, very wise, if you have somehow absorbed across all the centuries that separate you from the child who first learned this lesson, if some fragment of what she knew has come down to you through whatever channel stories find when they have no other way to travel, you will do what she did not do on that first night. You will go back inside. You will wake the people you love. You will add wood to the fire. You will not follow. Because the forest at night is patient, and the thing that waits inside it is more patient still, and it has been waiting longer than you have been alive, longer than everyone you have ever known has been alive, longer than the language you think in has existed, and it is not tired of waiting. It is nourished by the waiting itself. It draws something from the waiting, the way the child drew warmth from the fire, something necessary, something that sustains it through the long, cold nights when no one comes, when the village is careful, and the grandmothers are watchful, and the stories are told correctly at the right times of year, and the children know the rules and follow them. On those nights, the thing in the forest does not sleep. It simply waits, and the waiting is its own kind of company. And it knows, in the way that very old things know things, with a certainty that has nothing to prove and nothing to gain from being expressed, it knows that eventually someone will hear their name spoken in a voice they love, and they will be standing too close to the edge of what they know, and the love will rise in them like water rising in a vessel, filling every available space, and they will take one step and then another toward the trees. This is what darkness is, really. Not the absence of light, but the presence of patience. Not the end of the world, but the continuation of something that was here before the world as we know it began, and that will be here in whatever comes after, waiting at the edge of whatever fire we have managed to build, listening for the sound of footsteps moving in the wrong direction, toward the forest instead of away from it, toward the voice instead of toward the people sleeping safely inside, the people who do not yet know that someone they love has gotten up in the dark and is walking toward something that wears love as a tool and needs nothing else to do its work. Sleep now. The fire is still burning. The grandmother is still awake. You are still inside. Sleep now.